Rosemary's advisor is Dr. Chris Nemec. Her study is on predicting environmental behavior, a self-determination theory approach. Go ahead, Rosemary.
Great. So the inspiration for this project really came from my own passion for the environment and for understanding the human role in environmental destruction. So climate change is a leading global issue, and it is widely thought to be at the hands of human action. And therefore, I think that the field of psychology is a really important field to be tackling these issues. And there have been many different theoretical approaches taken. The one that I am kind of focusing on as a background to my own theory is value, belief, norm theory, which posits that biospheric and altruistic values predict environmental behavior as well as egoistic values. However, in my own theory, I am exploring the links using ecocentrism, which is the same as biocentrism, which both of those are the belief that humans are part of an ecosystem and equal to all other living beings within that ecosystem. I'm also focusing on anthropocentrism instead of egoistic attitudes, where anthropocentrism is the belief that humans are at the center of the ecosystem and that our needs are above those of other living beings within that ecosystem. So that is where my theory kind of diverges from the value, belief, norm theory. I'm also using self-determination theory as a starting point. So self-determination theory is a theory that speaks to a lot of different things, including motivation, development, well-being, and behavior, all kind of coming back to the three basic psychological needs of autonomy, competency, and relatedness. So most of the research previously done in self-determination theory is based in the motivation aspect, so focusing on autonomous or integrated motivation for enacting environmental behaviors. However, I am more interested in looking at goal contents theory, specifically the work of Brown and Castor in 2005, which showed that intrinsic values is a predictor of pro-environmental behavior and as well as extrinsic values. So according to this theory, intrinsic values are those such as self-growth, community development, and maintaining close relationships and good health, where extrinsic values are those such as wealth, fame, and image. So what my theory is doing is taking both the value, belief, norm theory and the goal content theory approach and kind of melding them together to add to this growing literature in the environmental domain within self-determination theory, and also proposing a new model, which is shown in the 4 studies that I have completed. So these represent the structural equation models used in the first 3 studies. So within these studies, pro-environmental behavior is defined as any behavior that positively affects the natural environment. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the methods, what those specifically are. So in study 1, we predicted that extrinsic values would be negatively associated with pro-environmental behavior intention through the indirect effect of both anthropocentric and ecocentric attitudes. And then the opposite relationship would be true for intrinsic values. And then we looked at a very similar model in study 2, but instead of looking at general values, we looked at environmental values specifically. And then in the 3rd study, we looked at those same 2 models, but in a longitudinal design so we could assess change. So in study 1, we used a cross-sectional design where we had 293 undergraduates. We used 3 measures of environmental behavior. We used the consumer choice task where they were asked to choose a TV that they would buy based on a number of different factors, one of those being an environmental factor. They were also asked to donate theoretical money to different organizations, some of those being environmental organizations. Those 2 measures did not end up working out, so we did not use them in any of our analyses. The pro-environmental behavior intention survey essentially asked what they would be willing to do in terms of environmental behavior. Would they be willing to vote for a green politician? Would they be willing to volunteer for an organization, etc.? And then we measured the attitudes, anthropocentrism and ecocentrism, and we measured their values on the aspirations index. And we also measured, used the measure of the general causality orientation scale just to see some of the more stable motivational tendencies. In the 2nd study, we also used a cross-sectional design. We had 187 undergraduates, and we used all the same measures in study 1. with the addition of goal linkages and environmental aspirations, where essentially participants created their own environmental goals and then linked those goals to environmental values. So for instance, in the original aspirations index, where it might ask to what extent they wanted to be admired by lots of different people, in the environmental aspirations, we would ask to what extent they would like to be admired by lots of different people for their environmentalism. And then in study 3, we used a longitudinal design over 4 weeks. At time 1, we had 280 undergraduates, and at time 2, we retained 198 undergraduates. So we had about a 70% retention rate. And we use all of the same measures in study 1 and study 2, but we did it at time 1 and at time 2. So in study 1, the model explains 37% of the variance in the environmental behavior intention, and our hypotheses were confirmed, including the indirect effects, where we found a negative indirect effect from extrinsic values to pro-environmental behavior intention through both anthropocentric attitudes and ecocentric attitudes, and then the opposite was also true for intrinsic values. For study 3A, where we also looked at change in general values, we found slightly different results, where we only found significant pathway from extrinsic values through anthropocentric attitudes to the environmental behavior intentions, and there was only that indirect effect. So together, these results suggest that anthropocentric attitudes are kind of an important and enduring link between extrinsic values and pro-environmental behavior intention. So in the second study, we found some different results as well. So we explained 33% of the variance in behavior intention. Our hypotheses were mostly confirmed, although there was no indirect effect from extrinsic environmental values. So we only found the indirect effect from intrinsic environmental values to behavior from the 2 attitudes. In study 3B, we found an indirect effect from extrinsic environmental values to behavior intention. And then we also found an indirect effect from change in intrinsic environmental values to change in behavior intention through the change in anthropocentric attitudes. So again, we can see that anthropocentrism is kind of an important middleman between these values, whether they be the extrinsic values or the intrinsic values. So some of the limitations across the 3 studies is that we're able to measure behavior intention and not actual behavior. And also because of the limitations of the design, we could not show causation. So in study 2 specifically, we were not able to find indirect effects from extrinsic environmental goals. So this might be because it's difficult to predict extrinsic possible features from college students' environmental goals. So for example, you're not going to get rich or famous from recycling more often or turning off the lights when you leave your room. So it might not have been as plausible to have those linkages. So something that might be able to fix this is using a non-student population where adults who maybe own homes or own cars or have more flexibility in their daily activities and their buying power can engage in different behaviors that are maybe more likely to link to those extrinsic possible features. And then in study 3, we're not able to find any pathways from any intrinsic pathways, which might just be because at time 1, those intrinsic values were already really high in the sample, and so it was difficult to assess change for time 2. So in study 4, we tried to address some of these issues by looking at an experimental design, and we also measured actual behavior. So we did a 1-week daily diary study with 260 undergraduates. At the baseline, they came in and they told us about their daily meat consumption, their usual showering time, and some of their electricity use behavior. And then they were asked to read 3 passages that talked about how those 3 behaviors negatively impacted the environment. And the instructions for those were represented by one of the 5 conditions. So they either received autonomy supportive language or controlled language, and they were either appealed to their intrinsic values or their extrinsic values. After reading those passages, they also completed a needs support questionnaire on how reading those passages and how the instructions supported their needs, and then also their motivation for reading the passages. So we hypothesized that there would be a significant main effect of language on the environmental behavior and the motivation, that there would also be a significant main effect of goal content on the environmental behavior and motivation, and that there would be an interaction of the 2. So we did not find any main effects for the daily meat average, and we also did not find any main effects for the electricity use. However, we did find main effects for the daily showering average, whereby there was a difference between the extrinsic values and the intrinsic values, such that people in the extrinsic value condition showered for longer times than those in the intrinsic value condition. We also found a significant main effect of language on the identified regulation. So those who were in the controlled language condition had less identified regulation than those in the autonomous and neutral conditions. We did not find any main effects, however, for introductory regulation. So the limitations of this study, we did not find any main effects for meat or electricity, which might be because showering is the easiest of those three behaviors to change for undergraduates. Meat is often tied to a lot of different cultural norms, and also isn't likely to change over the course of just 1 week after reading a short passage. It is a much more substantial behavioral change than, for instance, showering for 2 minutes less. And electricity isn't really in the control of college students. They can really only control, for instance, their dorm light or maybe a bathroom light, but they aren't necessarily going to be going around campus turning off lights all the time. And then this kind of speaks to the same issue in the other studies, where it might be more effective to use a non-student population, where again, they have more access to different behaviors. Another issue might be the manipulation itself, which might not have been as effective as you would hope. So some of the things we could do moving forward is repeating that manipulation not only at baseline, but also on day one, and running pilot studies to fine tune the manipulation before actually going on to complete a whole nother study. So the implications of the present research: the research adds to the self-determination theory literature in the environmental domain, and it also offers a new perspective on environmental behavior and behavior intention from a goal contents theory perspective, which furthers some previous work being done in the field. There's also some practical implications. So from a quick search online, I was able to find many examples of environmental messaging that speaks to extrinsic values and maybe uses controlling language. And it kind of begs the question of whether or not we can change this messaging to, change the messaging to focus on appealing to intrinsic values or using more autonomy supportive language. So for example, can this be changed to this? Can we, instead of bad for the economy, can it be bad for our community? Or instead of 8 simple ways to save money, maybe 8 simple ways to build relationships. And instead of using kind of controlling, demanding language, can we maybe again appeal to those intrinsic values? The findings of our research suggest that this simple change would make important difference in affecting behavior.